The rain had been falling for so long that the world seemed to forget what it looked like without it, turning the empty highway into a long stretch of black glass where every light bent and distorted into something unreal, and Gabriel Mercer rode through it like a man who no longer cared whether the road led somewhere or nowhere at all, his motorcycle cutting through the storm with a steady, controlled growl, the kind that didn't fight the chaos but moved with it, because chaos was something he understood, something that didn't pretend to be safe, something that didn't lie, and maybe that was why he noticed her when no one else would have, just a faint silhouette near the edge of the road, almost invisible between the shifting reflections and the curtain of rain, too still to be a traveler, too exposed to belong there by choice, and for a moment he considered riding past, because that was what experience taught him to do. Keep moving, don't get involved, don't stop for problems that weren't yours, but something about the way she stood there, slightly turned as if listening for something behind her instead of watching the road ahead, made that instinct falter. An instinct was something Gabriel trusted more than logic, more than reason, more than any lesson learned the easy way, so he slowed, not abruptly, not enough to draw attention, just enough to let his headlight sweep over her fully, and when it did, she reacted in a way that confirmed everything his instincts had all read. Why told him, she flinched, not away from the light itself, but like it had exposed her position to something she was trying desperately to stay hidden from, and that single reaction told him more than words ever could. She wasn't waiting for help, she was trying not to be found, and yet when he pulled over a short distance ahead, engine still running, she hesitated only for a second before moving toward him, because whatever was behind her was worse than whatever he might be, her steps uneven, her breathing already strained like she had been running far longer than her body could handle, and as she got closer, the details became clearer, soaked clothes clinging to her frame, dirt and mud streaked across her legs, a tear along her sleeve that didn't come from a simple fall, a faint bruise forming along her cheekbone, and her eyes, wide, alert, focused not on him but on everything around him, scanning, calculating, searching for threats even as she approached what should have been safety, and when she finally spoke, her voice barely carried through the rain, fragile but filled with something heavier than fear, something closer to certainty. Please. I don't want to die, and there was no drama in it, no exaggeration, no attempt to manipulate sympathy. It was a statement, plain and final, like she wasn't afraid of what might happen, she was describing what would happen if nothing changed, and Gabriel didn't ask the usual questions, didn't waste time on things that didn't matter in moments like this. Because he had seen enough to understand the situation without needing a full explanation. This wasn't someone lost, this wasn't someone in trouble by accident, this was someone being hunted, and the way her body stayed slightly angled toward the darkness behind her, the way her shoulders tensed every time the wind shifted or a branch moved, told him that whatever was coming wasn't far. Who's after you? He asked, his voice calm, steady, not because he wasn't concerned, but because panic didn't help anyone survive. And she shook her head immediately, not refusing to answer but unable to say it, like giving shape to it with words. Would make it real in a way she couldn't control. I can't. They'll hear, she whispered, and that was enough, because it meant they were close enough for her to believe that, close enough that time wasn't a luxury they had, and as if to confirm it, a sound carried through the rain, faint at first but unmistakable, the low rumble of an engine somewhere in the distance, then another, not loud enough to be right behind them, but not far enough to ignore, and the effect it had on her was immediate. Her entire body stiffened, her breath catching in her throat as she turned slightly, eyes locking onto the darkness like she expected something to emerge from it at any second, and that was all Gabriel needed to decide, not because he knew the full story, not because he understood the stakes completely, but because he recognized the pattern, the kind that didn't end well for people like her if no one intervened, and maybe, deep down, there was a part of him that was tired of seeing how those patterns usually played out, so he reached back, grabbing the spare helmet secured behind him, and held it out without another word. Get on, he said, simple, direct, leaving no room for hesitation, and for a moment she just stared at him, her expression caught between fear and disbelief, like she hadn't expected anyone to actually step in, like she had already accepted that this was how it ended for her, alone, in the dark, with no way out. And then the sound behind them grew louder, clearer now, engines moving closer, steady, deliberate. Not passing THR. Oof but searching, and that hesitation shattered instantly. She took the helmet with shaking hands, fumbling slightly as she put it on, her fingers cold and unsteady, and then she climbed onto the bike behind him, gripping tightly without needing to be told, because instinct told her the same thing his did, that staying meant being caught, and being caught meant something worse than death, and Gabriel didn't wait any longer. He twisted the throttle and the motorcycle surged forward, cutting through the rain, leaving the stretch of highway behind as he veered onto a narrow side road that barely registered as an option to anyone who didn't know it existed, the tires gripping the wet asphalt with practiced precision as he pushed the speed just enough to create distance without losing control, and behind them, the engines reacted, growing louder for a brief moment before fading as he took another turn, then another. Roads splitting into paths dissolving into darkness, routes that couldn't be followed unless you already knew where they led, and he didn't look back, didn't need to, because he could feel the pursuit struggling to keep up, not gone, not ended, but disrupted, and that was the first step, buying time, creating space, forcing the hunters to adjust instead of closing in, and behind him, the girl held on tightly, her breathing still uneven but slowly stabilizing, her body adjusting to the movement, to the rhythm of escape, and after a few minutes, her voice came again, quieter now, but clearer, less panic and more awareness. "They won't stop," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that made Gabriel listen more closely, not just the words, but the certainty behind them. They never stop, and that wasn't fear speaking, that was experience, that was knowledge earned the hard way, and Gabriel's grip on the handlebars tightened slightly, not from doubt, but from recognition, because he had known people like that before, people who didn't chase for the thrill or the anger, but because stopping wasn't part of who they were, and as the road stretched further into the darkness, one thing became clear: this wasn't just a random encounter, this wasn't a simple act of helping someone in trouble, this was the beginning of something much larger, something that had already been set in motion long before he arrived, and now, whether he wanted it or not, he had stepped directly into it, and there was no turning back, not for him, and definitely not for her, because the moment she climbed onto that bike, her fate and his became tied together in a way neither of them fully understood yet, but both of them would soon be forced to face, and somewhere behind them, out in the darkness beyond the reach of the fading road, the engines didn't stop, they didn't turn away, they kept moving, slower now, more careful, adjusting their path, recalculating. Because the hunt wasn't over, it had only just begun, and this time, they weren't chasing a frightened girl anymore, they were chasing something else entirely, something that had just become far more dangerous than they expected. The rain eased just enough to turn from a relentless curtain into a cold mist that clung to the road and blurred the edges of everything ahead, but Gabriel didn't slow, because slowing now meant giving whatever was behind them time to close the gap, and distance was the only advantage they had, even if it was temporary, even if it was fragile, and behind him the girl, still unnamed, still a stranger, kept her grip tight around his jacket, her body pressed close not out of trust but necessity. Because the speed, the cold, and the fear left her no other option, and after several minutes of cutting through narrow roads and forgotten turns, Gabriel shifted direction again, taking a route that broke away from anything predictable, a path that curved into a stretch of forest where the pavement thinned and eventually gave way to rougher ground, the kind of place most drivers avoided. But he didn't stop until the sound of their engine became the only one he could hear, and even then, he pushed a little further before finally easing off the throttle and bringing the bike to a controlled stop beneath the cover of dense trees where the world seemed to hold its breath, the silence settling around them in a way that made every small sound feel amplified, every movement noticeable, and for a moment neither of them moved, the engine ticking softly as it cooled, the mist drifting between the branches. And then she slowly loosened her grip and climbed off the bike, her legs unsteady at first as they adjusted to standing still again, her hands still trembling slightly as she removed the helmet and held it close to her chest like it was something solid in a world that had stopped making sense, and Gabriel turned just enough to look at her properly for the first time without the distortion of motion or rain between them, and what he saw confirmed what he had already suspected: this wasn't just fear. This was exhaustion layered over panic, layered over something deeper, something that didn't fade just because she had escaped for a moment. "They're not right behind us anymore," he said, his voice low but steady, not offering reassurance, just stating what he knew to be true for now, and she nodded slightly, but her eyes didn't relax, they kept scanning the trees, the darkness between them, as if she expected something to emerge at any second. "They'll find us again," she said quietly, and there it was again. That certainty, not fear of the unknown, but knowledge of what was coming, and Gabriel studied her for a second before asking, "Who are they?" And this time she hesitated longer, her fingers tightening around the helmet, her gaze dropping briefly before lifting again. "People who don't stop once they start," she answered, and while it wasn't a direct answer, it was enough to paint the outline of the truth, and Gabriel exhaled slowly, processing, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flashlight, sweeping the beam briefly across the ground around them, checking for fresh tracks, broken branches, anything that might give away their position or confirm that they had been followed more closely than expected. But for now, there was nothing, just wet earth, scattered leaves, and the faint marks left by his own tires. "You got a name?" he asked, glancing back at her, and she hesitated again, as if even that simple detail carried weight. "Lena," she said finally, and he nodded once, accepting it without question. Whether it was real or not didn't matter right now, names could wait, survival couldn't. "All right, Lena," he said, slipping the flashlight away, "we don't stay here long," and she nodded again, but this time there was a flicker of something else in her expression, something that hadn't been there before, a question forming. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice quieter now, less frantic, more uncertain, and Gabriel didn't answer immediately, because the truth wasn't simple, it wasn't something he could explain in a sentence. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was something from his past, maybe it was just that he had seen too many situations like this end the wrong way, and he was tired of watching it happen, but instead of saying any of that, he just shrugged slightly. "Wrong place, right time," he said, and she stared at him for a second like she was trying to decide if that answer made sense, if anything about this situation made sense anymore, and before she could press further, a sound cut through the quiet, faint but distinct, an engine, far off but moving, and both of them reacted instantly, her body tensing, his posture shifting as he turned his head slightly, listening more carefully, isolating the direction, the distance, the speed, and this time there was no doubt, they were being followed, maybe not directly on their path, maybe not with perfect accuracy, but close enough to matter, close enough that staying still wasn't an option. "They're tracking," she whispered, her voice tightening again, and Gabriel nodded once, already moving toward the bike. "Yeah," he said, "and they're not guessing anymore," and that realization changed everything, because it meant this wasn't just a random search, it meant they had something to guide them, something to narrow the distance. And as Lena stepped closer, her EYes searching his face for answers he didn't have yet, she spoke again, faster this time, urgency creeping back in. "They have ways, they always have ways, they don't just look, they follow patterns, she cut herself off, shaking her head as if trying to stop the spiral of thoughts before it took over completely, and Gabriel placed a hand briefly on the handlebar, grounding himself in the moment, in the decision he had already made. "Then we break the pattern," he said simply, and she looked at him, confusion mixing with a fragile sense of hope. "How?" she asked, and he met her gaze for a second, steady, certain. "By not doing what they expect," he replied, and without another word, he swung back onto the bike, kicking it to life as the engine roared again, cutting through the silence like a declaration, and Lena didn't hesitate this time. She put the helmet back on quickly and climbed behind him, her grip firm, her body closer, more aligned with his movements. And as they pulled away from the temporary cover of the trees and disappeared deeper into the forest, the sound of the distant engine grew slightly louder, not because it was gaining on them directly, but because it was moving in the same direction, adjusting, closing in through its own path, and somewhere out there, whoever was chasing them was no longer searching blindly, they were adapting, learning, and that made them more dangerous than before. And as the road twisted ahead into darker, narrower terrain, one thing became clear to both of them: this wasn't just a matter of running anymore, this was a game of survival where every move mattered, every decision counted, and one mistake would be enough to end it all. And behind them, unseen but relentless, the hunt continued, not slowing, not fading, but tightening, step by step, mile by mile, drawing closer to the moment where running wouldn't be enough anymore, and when that moment came, there would be no second chances, only choices that couldn't be undone. The forest swallowed them whole as Gabriel pushed the bike deeper into terrain that most people would never dare to cross at night, the narrow path twisting between thick trees and uneven ground, branches scraping against his jacket while the tires struggled for grip over wet dirt and loose stones, but he didn't slow more than necessary because speed, even controlled speed, was still their best chance at staying ahead. And behind him Lena adapted faster now, her body no longer rigid with panic, but moving with the rhythm of the motorcycle, leaning when he leaned, tightening her grip when the terrain shifted, learning without being told because survival had already forced her to become something sharper than she had been before, and after several minutes the path began to narrow even further until it was barely a trail at all, just a suggestion of direction between trees, and that was when Gabriel made his move, cutting sharply off the visible track into a patch of dense brush where the bike forced its way through with resistance, leaves snapping, branches bending, until they broke into a small clearing hidden from the main path, and without hesitation he killed the engine, letting the sudden silence crash down around them, heavy and absolute, and Lena stayed still behind him for a second, listening, her breath uneven again but controlled, waiting for him to speak. "Off," he said quietly, and she slid down carefully, her boots sinking slightly into the damp ground as she removed the helmet, her eyes immediately scanning the darkness around them. "Why are we stopping?" she whispered, and Gabriel didn't answer right away, instead stepping back toward the trail they had left, crouching slightly as he studied the ground, the broken branches, the disturbed earth where the tires had cut through, and then he reached for a fallen limb nearby and dragged it across the marks, distorting the pattern, breaking the clean line of direction, making it harder to follow at a glance. And Lena watched him, understanding, forming piece by piece. "You're hiding the trail," she said, and he shook his head slightly. "I'm confusing it," he corrected, because hiding was never perfect, but confusion bought time, and time was what they needed, and once he finished, he turned back to her, his expression focused, already calculating the next move. "We go on foot," he said, and her eyes widened slightly. "On foot?" she repeated, glancing instinctively at the bike like leaving it behind felt like giving up their only advantage. "They'll expect us to keep moving fast," he explained, "so we don't," and for a moment she hesitated, the weight of everything pressing in again, but then she nodded, because she understood now, this wasn't about speed, it was about unpredictability, and they moved, stepping carefully through the trees, Gabriel leading, choosing a path that cut at an angle away from the false trail, each step deliberate, avoiding obvious patterns, avoiding broken ground where possible, using rocks, roots, anything that would leave less of a trace, and Lena followed closely, matching his movements as best she could, her breathing steadying as she focused on each step instead of the fear behind her, and for a while there was nothing but the sound of their footsteps and the distant whisper of wine through the trees, until a faint noise broke through the quiet, subtle but unmistakable. An engine, not loud, not close, but present, and both of them stopped instantly, their bodies freezing in place as they listened, the sound coming and going with the shifts in the wind, but there was no mistaking it. "They're still following," Lena whispered, her voice tight, and Gabriel nodded slightly, his gaze shifting toward the direction of the sound. "Yeah," he said, "and they're getting smarter about it, because the engine wasn't rushing anymore. It was moving slowly, methodically, like who Eve R was driving. It was searching, adjusting, not chasing blindly but tracking with intent, and that made the situation more dangerous than before, because it meant they were learning, adapting to every move Gabriel made, and he exhaled slowly, thinking, recalculating, then motioned for Lena to follow again. "We change elevation," he said, and they began moving uphill, the ground becoming steeper, more uneven, forcing them to slow slightly but also giving them an advantage. Higher ground meant better visibility, better control, and as they climbed, the forest thinned just enough to allow glimpses of the lower terrain behind them, and after several minutes, Gabriel stopped again, dropping low behind a cluster of rocks, and Lena mirrored him immediately, crouching beside him, her eyes following his line of sight, and there, through the trees below, movement, 2 figures, maybe 3, spreading out as they moved, not rushing, not panicking, but scanning the ground, the surroundings, looking for signs, and Lena's breath caught. "That's them," she whispered, and Gabriel didn't respond, his focus locked on their movements, analyzing, counting, measuring distance, and what he saw confirmed everything he had suspected. These weren't amateurs, they knew how to track, how to search, how to close in without exposing themselves unnecessarily, and that meant running alone wouldn't be enough. Eventually they would close the gap. Eventually they would corner them, and that realization shifted something inside him, because up until now, this had been about escape, about buying time, about staying ahead, but now it was becoming something else, something more direct, more final, and beside him, Lena seemed to sense that shift, her voice quieter now, more controlled. "We can't keep running forever," she said, not as a question but as a realization, and Gabriel finally looked at her, his expression steady, unshaken. "No," he said, and there was a pause, heavy with everything that hadn't been said yet, everything that was about to change, and then he added, "But we don't have to," and the meaning behind those words settled between them, clear and unavoidable, because there was only one other option left, and it wasn't about escaping anymore, it was about ending the chase before it ended them, and as the figures below continued to move, unaware that they had been spotted, unaware that the situation had just shifted in a way they didn't expect, Lena felt something change inside her too, the fear still there, but no longer in control, replaced by something harder, something sharper, something that had been building since the moment she stepped onto that road and whispered those words, and now, as she looked at Gabriel, she understood that whatever happened next, there was no going back to what she had been before, because survival had already changed her, and the man beside her wasn't just helping her run anymore, he was preparing to make sure they didn't have to run again. And somewhere below, the men who had been hunting her were getting closer, unaware that the balance of the hunt had just begun to shift against them. The men below didn't rush, and that alone told Gabriel everything he needed to know about the kind of people they were dealing with, because amateurs chased noise and movement while professionals moved with patience, reading the ground like a story that had already been written, and right now they were reading every mistake that could have been made, every broken branch, every disturbed patch of earth, every sign that pointed to direction and intent, and Gabriel knew that if he let them continue at that pace without interference, they would eventually piece together enough of the trail to close the distance, maybe not immediately, maybe not cleanly, but inevitably, and inevitability was something he refused to allow, so he shifted slightly behind the rocks, lowering his profile as he studied their formation more carefully, counting again, confirming, 3 of them now clearly visible, spread out in a loose triangle, each covering a different angle, communicating without speaking, and that meant there were likely more somewhere beyond what he could see, which made the situation even tighter than it already was, and beside him Lena remained still, her breathing controlled but her eyes locked on the figures below, not with panic now but with a growing clarity, like seeing them in the open had turned them from an abstract fear into something real, something tangible, something that could be understood and, maybe, fought. "They're closer than before," she whispered. And Gabriel nodded slightly, his gaze never leaving the men. "They found part of the trail," he said quietly, "not all of it, but enough," and that was the problem, because partial information in the hands of people like that was often more dangerous than no information at all. It forced them to think, to adapt, to anticipate, and that was exactly what they were doing, adjusting their spacing, slowing their movement, tightening their search pattern, and Gabriel knew that whatever came next had to disrupt that process completely, not just delay it, not just confuse it, but break it in a way that forced them to react instead of plan, because the moment they stopped thinking clearly was the moment he could take control of the situation, and he exhaled slowly, making the decision that had been forming since the moment he saw them. "We split their focus," he said, his voice low but firm, and Lena turned to him, her expression tightening slightly. "What does that mean?" she asked, and he finally looked at her, meeting her gaze with a calm that didn't come from ignorance but from certainty. "It means they stop hunting you," he said, "and start chasing me," and the weight of those words hit instantly, her eyes widening just enough to show the fear behind them. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head, "that's not," but he cut her off with a small gesture, not harsh, not forceful, just final. "It's the only way to break their pattern," he said, and she stared at him, searching for another option, another path that didn't involve him putting himself directly in their line of fire, but there wasn't one, not anymore, and she knew it, even if she didn't want to accept it. "They'll kill you," she said quietly, and for a brief moment there was something almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth, not because he found it funny, but because he had heard that certainty before, many times, in many different forms. "Only if they catch me," he replied, and before she could argue again, he shifted his position, preparing to move, but then paused just long enough to add something else, something that mattered more than the plan itself. When I move, you go the opposite direction, he said. Stay low, stay quiet, don't run unless you have to, and don't come back for me. And that last part landed hardest, because it wasn't a suggestion, it was an instruction. And Lena felt the resistance rise in her chest immediately, the instinct to refuse, to reject T. The idea of leaving him behind after everything he had already done, but the look in his eyes stopped her, not because it was intimidating, but because it was clear, focused, already committed, and she realized in that moment that arguing would only waste time they didn't have. You better be right, she said finally, her voice steady despite everything, and he nodded once. I usually am, he answered, and with that, he moved, slipping away from the cover of the rocks and angling down the slope. Just enough to be seen, not fully exposed, not reckless, just visible enough to draw attention, and it worked almost immediately. One of the men below looked up, his posture shifting as he caught sight of movement where there shouldn't have been any, and in the next second, the others reacted, their formation tightening, their focus snapping toward Gabriel's position, and that was all the opening Lena needed. She moved in the opposite direction, staying low as instructed, her steps careful and controlled as she disappeared into the trees, her heart pounding but her mind focused on one thing only: keep moving, don't stop, don't look back, because looking back would only slow her down and make everything he was doing meaningless. And behind her, the situation escalated quickly, voices cutting through the forest, sharp, controlled. There. One of them called, and then the sound of movement increased, footsteps accelerating, branches snapping under pressure, the hunt shifting direction as they committed to the new target, and Gabriel used that shift to his advantage, moving laterally across the slope, forcing them to adjust their angles, to chase instead of track, to react instead of plan, and the difference was immediate. Their movements became faster but less precise, their spacing tighter but more vulnerable, and that was exactly what he needed, because chaos, when controlled, was an advantage, and he knew how to control it better than most. A shot cracked through the trees, sharp and sudden, the sound echoing off the surrounding terrain, and another followed shortly after, closer this time, but still wide, not aimed to hit, but to pressure, to force movement, to create mistakes, and Gabriel didn't give them that satisfaction. He kept moving with purpose, changing direction just enough to stay unpredictable, using the terrain to break line of sight, forcing them to guess where he would appear next. And behind all of that, Lena continued to move, putting distance between herself and the chaos unfolding behind her, each step taking her further away from the immediate danger, but not from the reality of what was happening, because she knew, even without seeing it, that he was risking everything to give her that chance. And that knowledge pushed her forward faster, harder, more determined than before. And Sumu. Here in the distance, beyond the trees and the shifting terrain, the faint outline of a road began to take shape, not clear, not close, but there, a possibility, a direction, a way out, and as she moved toward it, one thing became certain: this wasn't just about escaping anymore, this was about finishing something that had already gone too far, something that had taken too much, and whether she wanted it or not, she was now part of how it would end, because the moment Gabriel stepped into their path and pulled their focus away from her, everything changed. The hunt had shifted, the balance had broken, and the people who had been chasing her were no longer in control of how this story would play out, even if they didn't realize it yet. And as the sounds of pursuit echoed behind her, growing louder, then fading, then shifting direction again, one truth settled in deeper than anything else. This was no longer a question of whether they would stop, it was a question of who would still be standing when it was over, and that answer was getting closer with every second that passed. The forest didn't end so much as it thinned into something uncertain, the trees loosening their grip on the land just enough to reveal slivers of gray sky in distant elevation, and Lena felt it before she fully saw it, that subtle shift in space that meant she was getting closer to something open, something that might lead somewhere beyond the constant pressure of being hunted. But she didn't slow, because slowing meant thinking, and thinking meant fear could creep back in, and fear was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore, not after everything that had happened. not after the sound of gunshots had followed her through the trees, not after the man who had chosen to stand between her and death was still back there, drawing the danger away from her with a calm certainty she didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore, and every step she took now carried that weight, that responsibility, because if she stopped, if she failed, then everything he was risking would mean nothing, and she refused to let that happen. Her breath burned in her chest, her legs screamed with exhaustion, but she kept moving, pushing through brush and uneven ground until the trees finally broke enough to reveal what lay ahead, a narrow strip of road cutting through the landscape, cracked and forgotten but real, solid, a path that led somewhere other than deeper into the trap she had been running from, and for a moment she slowed just enough to take it in, the sight almost unreal after everything. But then His sound behind her snapped her back into motion, distant but unmistakable, movement, voices, not as close as before but still there, still following, still refusing to let go, and she didn't hesitate anymore. She sprinted toward the road, her body pushing past its limits because stopping now wasn't an option, not when she was this close, not when there was still a chance, and as she reached the edge of the road, stumbling slightly as her feet hit the uneven asphalt, she turned instinctively. Her eyes scanning the tree line she had just emerged from, expecting to see something, someone, anything that confirmed how close the danger still was, but for a moment there was nothing, just the quiet stretch of road and the distant echo of the forest behind her, and then she heard it, not from behind, but from ahead, the deep, unmistakable rumble of a motorcycle engine approaching fast, and her heart jumped, fear and hope colliding in a way that made it hard to tell the difference, and she took a step back, uncertain, unsure whether this was another threat or the one chance she had left, and then the bike came into view, breaking through the curve in the road with controlled speed, the rider leaning slightly as he adjusted his line, and as he got closer, the details became clearer, the familiar posture, the way the machine moved as if it was an extension of the rider rather than something separate, and Lena felt a surge of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel yet, relief. Bika. It wasn't one of them, it was someone else, someone who might actually be on her side, and the bike slowed as it approached her, coming to a controlled stop a few meters away, the rider removing his helmet just enough for her to see his face, and there was no confusion there, no hesitation, just recognition. "You're the girl," he said, his voice steady, like he had been expecting her, and Lena nodded quickly, her breath still uneven. "Gabriel." He said there might be someone, she managed, and the man nodded once, already understanding more than she had said. "Yeah," he replied, "he usually makes sure there is," and for a brief moment she just stood there, processing, trying to reconcile the fact that even while being chased, even while drawing danger toward himself, Gabriel had still planned ahead, still made sure she had a way out. And that realization hit harder than anything else, because it meant he hadn't just reacted, he had chosen this path fully, knowingly, and she felt something tighten in her chest at the thought, but before she could say anything else, the man gestured toward the bike. "Get on," he said, and this time she didn't hesitate at all, she moved immediately, climbing onto the back with practiced urgency, her body still shaking but her movements focused, and as soon as she was secure, the engine roared back to life, the sound cutting through the stillness of the road like a declaration, and they took off, accelerating quickly, leaving the forest behind, but even as the distance grew, Lena couldn't stop herself from looking back one last time, her eyes searching the tree line for any sign of what was happening behind her, any indication of whether Gabriel was still standing, still fighting, still alive, but there was nothing visible from here, just the dark edge of the forest and the unknown that lay within it. And that was the hardest part, not knowing, not being able to see how it ended. Not being able to know if the man who had chosen to protect her would walk away from it, and as the road stretched ahead, the wind rushing past her, carrying away the immediate sound of danger, one thing became painfully clear: her escape didn't mean the end of the story, it was only one part of it, because back in the forest, the real confrontation was still unfolding, and Gabriel Mercer wasn't running anymore. He was doing something far more dangerous, he was standing his ground, and as the men who had been hunting Lena closed in on his position, their movements faster now, more aggressive, their patience giving way to urgency as they realized their target had slipped away, the situation shifted into something final, something unavoidable, because there was no more distance to manage, no more time to buy, only the moment itself, and Gabriel stood in the middle of it, calm, controlled, every movement deliberate. His mind already steps ahead, anticipating, adjusting, preparing for the endgame that had been building since the moment he stopped on that rain-soaked highway and chose not to ride past, and the first of them reached him quickly, emerging through the trees with weapon raised, but Gabriel was ready, his reaction immediate, precise, closing the distance before the man could fully commit, breaking his balance, disarming him in a fluid motion that left no room for recovery, and the second came in from the side. Faster, more aggressive, but Gabriel shifted again, using the terrain, the momentum, turning their advantage into vulnerability, forcing them into positions they didn't want to be in, and for a moment, the forest became a blur of movement and impact, controlled violence executed with purpose rather than chaos, and the men realized too late that this wasn't the kind of fight they had expected, this wasn't a desperate target trying to survive. This was someone who understood conflict at a level they hadn't accounted for, someone who didn't just react, but dictated the pace, the direction, the outcome, and as the confrontation escalated, as more of them closed in, drawn by the noise, by the urgency of the situation slipping out of their control, one thing became clear: they had underestimated what they were dealing with. They had assumed this was just another obstacle, just another variable in their hunt, but Gabriel Mercer wasn't a variable. He was the point where everything changed, and as the fight pushed deeper into the forest, away from the path Lena had taken, away from the road that now carried her further from danger, the outcome of this encounter began to take shape, not in clear lines or easy answers, but in the undeniable shift of control, the moment where the hunters realized they were no longer the ones deciding how this would end, and somewhere far ahead, as the road carried Lena and her unlikely rescuer further into safety, she held on to one thought above all others, that this wasn't over yet, that whatever happened next would define everything that came after, and that when the story was finally told, when the truth came out about what had happened in those woods, one thing would stand above the rest: the moment a man chose not to walk away, and everything that followed because of it. The road stretched on in a long, unbroken line that seemed almost unreal after the suffocating density of the forest, and Lena clung to the back of the motorcycle as the wind tore past her, carrying with it the last echoes of the place she had escaped from, but not the weight of what had been left behind, because that weight stayed with her, heavy and constant, pressing into every thought, every breath, every second that passed without knowing what had happened to Gabriel, and no matter how far the bike carried her, no matter how fast they moved, that question refused to fade. It only grew louder in the silence between the engine's roar and her own racing heartbeat, and the man driving didn't speak for a long time, not because he didn't have anything to say, but because he understood that some moments needed space, needed time to settle before words could make any sense, and eventually, when the road curved and the trees pulled back just enough to reveal a wider stretch of land ahead, he eased off the throttle slightly and spoke, his voice steady, measured. "Name's Cutter," he said, like introduction still mattered even in the middle of everything, and Lena tightened her grip slightly before answering, her voice still carrying the strain of everything she had just endured. "Lena," she replied, and Cutter nodded once, not looking back but acknowledging it. "Figured," he said, "Gabriel doesn't step in unless it matters." And those words landed harder than anything else. Because they confirmed what she was already beginning to understand, that none of this had been random, that Gabriel hadn't just reacted, he had chosen, deliberately, fully aware of what it would cost him, and she swallowed hard, her voice quieter now. "He's still back there," she said, not as a question, but as a fact she was trying to accept, and Cutter didn't answer right away, his focus on the road ahead, but after a moment, he spoke again. "Yeah," he said simply, "and if anyone can handle it, it's him," and there was confidence in his tone, not blind optimism, but something grounded in experience, something that suggested he had seen Gabriel walk through situations like this before, but Lena wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse, because knowing someone was capable didn't mean they were invincible, and the memory of the men in the forest, the way they moved, the way they hunted, reminded her that this wasn't a simple fight, this was something deeper, something organized. Something that didn't end easily, and as the bike continued forward, putting more distance between them and the forest, she finally spoke again, her voice carrying a new kind of urgency. "We can't just leave him," she said, and this time Cutter did glance back slightly, just enough for her to see the expression on his face, not dismissive, not annoyed, but firm. "We're not," he replied, we're doing exactly what he planned. And that stopped her, confusion cutting through the emotional storm. Inside. Her, planned, she repeated, and Cutter nodded once. He doesn't improvise everything, he said. He knew if things got bad, he'd need to pull them away from you, and if he did that, he'd need us ready on the other side, and Lena felt something shift inside her, because that meant Gabriel hadn't just acted in the moment, he had thought ahead, set pieces in place, made sure there was a path forward even if it meant putting himself directly in danger, and that realization brought with it a mix of emotions she didn't fully know how to process, fear for what he was facing, gratitude for what he had done, and a growing sense that this wasn't over, not by a long shot, and as if sensing that, Cutter slowed the bike again as they approached a turn that led off the main road, a narrower path branching away toward a cluster of old structures barely visible in the distance. We're not done yet, he said, more to himself than to her. And Lena's grip tightened again, her focus sharpening. What do you mean? She asked, and Cutter guided the bike onto the path, the terrain rougher now but manageable. I mean, he replied, those guys weren't just chasing you for nothing, and the weight of that statement settled in immediately, because she already knew that, deep down, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way she couldn't ignore. They're not going to stop just because you got away, he continued, they'll regroup, they'll track again, and next time they won't make the same mistakes, and Lena's mind raced, connecting pieces, memories of what she had seen, what she had overheard before everything went wrong, the reason she had been running in the first place, and for a moment she hesitated, unsure whether to say it, unsure whether bringing it into the open would make things worse, but then she realized there was no point holding back anymore, not after everything that had happened. They weren't just following me, she said, her voice steadier now, they were trying to get something I have, and Cutter didn't react immediately, but she felt the shift in his posture, the slight tightening that meant he was paying closer attention now. What kind of something? He asked, and Lena closed her eyes for a brief second, gathering herself, before answering. Proof, she said, of what they're doing, who they're connected to, everything, and the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy, filled with the implications of that single word, because proof meant leverage, proof meant exposure, proof meant danger on a level far beyond a simple chase, and Cutter let out a slow breath. Yeah, he muttered. That explains a lot, and as the path opened into a small clearing with an old building at its center, he brought the bike to a stop, cutting the engine and letting the quiet settle around them again, and this time Lena didn't hesitate to get off, her movements quicker, more focused, because now she understood, this wasn't just about surviving anymore, this was about finishing something that had already cost too much, and as Cutter led her toward the building, pulling open the door and stepping inside, she followed closely, her mind still racing, her thoughts pulling back toward the forest, toward Gabriel, toward the fight she hadn't seen the end of, and she stopped just inside the doorway, turning back toward Cutter. We have to go back, she said, and he shook his head immediately. Not yet, he replied, and she frowned, frustration rising. Why not? And this time he faced her fully, his expression serious, grounded. Because if we go back without a plan, we're just adding more targets, he said, and she knew he was right, even if she didn't want to accept it, even if every instinct inside her screamed to go back, to make sure he was alive, to not leave him behind, but logic cut through emotion, harsh but necessary, and she exhaled slowly, forcing herself to think, to focus, to do what needed to be done instead of what she wanted to do. Then what's the plan? She asked, and Cutter's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in calculation. First, he said, you show me exactly what they're after, and Lena hesitated for only a second before reaching into her jacket, pulling out the small, hidden drive she had kept with her through everything, the one thing she had refused to lose no matter what happened, and she held it out, her hand steady despite everything. This, she said, and Cutter took it carefully, turning it over in his fingers like he already understood the weight it carried. Then we make sure it gets to the right place, he said, and after that, he paused, his gaze lifting to meet hers, we make sure they don't come after you again, and Lena felt a quiet resolve settle into her chest, stronger than fear, stronger than doubt, because now there was direction, now there was purpose, and she nodded once. And Gabriel? She asked, and Cutter didn't hesitate this time. We don't leave him, he said, and that was enough, not a guarantee, not a promise of an easy outcome, but a commitment, and as they moved further into the building, preparing for what came next, one thing was clear: this wasn't the end of the story, it was the turning point, the moment where survival became something more, something bigger. Something that would reach far beyond the forest they had just left behind, because the truth Lena carried wasn't just dangerous, it was powerful, and power like that didn't just change lives, it changed everything. And somewhere back in the woods, Gabriel Mercer was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to back down, and whether he knew it or not, the choices being made here, in this quiet, forgotten place, would determine how his fight ended, because this was no longer just about one girl running from men who wouldn't stop. This was about exposing something that had been hidden for far too long, something that had hurt too many people, something that needed to end. And as Lena stood there, holding on to the only thing that could make that happen, she realized that the fear that had driven her this far was no longer the thing pushing her forward, it was something else now, something stronger, something unbreakable, and for the first time since that night began, she didn't feel like she was running anymore. She felt like she was moving towards something, something that mattered, so meeting that would make everything she had been through worth it. And as the storm that had started it all finally began to fade somewhere beyond the horizon, replaced by the first faint signs of dawn, one truth settled into place, clear and undeniable: they hadn't just survived, they had changed the outcome, and whatever came next, it wouldn't be the hunters deciding how this story ended, it would be them, because when she whispered, "Please, I don't want to die," she thought she was asking for a chance to survive, but what she got instead was something far more powerful, a chance to fight back, and that was something no one had expected, not the men who chased her, not the world that had ignored her, and maybe not even the man who chose to stop on that rain-soaked road, but in the end, that choice changed everything, and as the first light of morning broke through the clouds, illuminating a path forward that hadn't existed before, one thing became certain: this story wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about what happened when someone refused to let fear decide the ending. And that was something that would echo far beyond that single night, far beyond that single road, into something much bigger than any of them had imagined, because sometimes, the moment you think everything is about to end is actually the moment everything begins, and for Lena, for Gabriel, and for everyone who would be affected by what came next, that moment had finally arrived.